So I received a message from a viewer who had some sobering news for me. I'll admit they had my attention, so I asked them what was the news. They informed me that the Toro trimmer that I admire so much was in fact the same trimmer as a brand I didn't care for. I very kindly asked them for their proof, and the response, I'll have to admit, was a little shocking. What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by. In today's project, we look at these two trimmers from Toro and Ryobi. Now, there really isn't a problem with them, except I'm having a hard time believing what I was told. The claim was that these two trimmers are in fact the same, just with different accessories like the covers, fuel tanks, recoils, carbs, and shafts. I think that pretty much covers it. As you can tell, I don't really believe this to be true, so much so I decided to make my own video trying to figure out the truth. Now, I'll admit there seems to be some similarities between them, but trimmers aren't all that different. They have an engine on one side of a shaft with a trimmer head on the other end and a handle and trigger somewhere in the middle. Now, surprisingly, as proof, the viewer made their own video showing and describing the similarities, which I found to be very compelling. Unfortunately, they didn't have the time to make a longer video, so I told them I would look into it, and boy, I kind of wish I hadn't. So in their video, the proof was in the labeling. If we take a look at the Toro's build label, we can see that it was built by Tektronix Industries North America in April of 2011. Now if we take a look at the build label for the Ryobi, we can see that it too was built by Tektronix Industries North America in April of 2015. Now as compelling as the information was, I wasn't convinced that they were the same engine, only that they were manufactured by the same company. The only other discrepancy is that the Ryobi is sized at 25 cc's while the Toro is slightly larger at 25.4 cc's. I know that doesn't sound like much, but the fact is they aren't the same by displacement. But what if we compare them externally? Does it matter that the fuel tanks look alike right down to the mounting holes? However, if you take a look at them from a different angle, you can see that the Toro tank is 50% bigger than the Ryobi. So instead of running for 30 minutes, the Toro should last about 45 before it runs out of fuel. I know body plastics don't mean anything as they just cover the engine and direct airflow to keep it cool, but as you can see, the Ryobi's recoil assembly is part of the rear cover, while the Toro's is separate from its engine cover. We might gain better insight on the build differences if we take them apart to compare them side by side. So here's the recoil assembly, and there's really nothing special about it. The only thing notable is that the plastics that make up the housing for the recoil is really thin. Now the back of the engine is interesting because it has these 4 holes here that are not tapped for bolts, and the mounting bolts for the rear cover are at the bottom. If we take a look at the Toro, I suspect it'll look a lot like this one. So this is the rear cover for the Toro, and there's nothing really special about it, but I like its design a lot more than the Ryobi's. The real difference is the recoil assembly. The plastic for this one has a more substantial feeling when compared to the other one, and the other thing that's notable is that the cam is spring-loaded, so it's easier to pull the engine over, although if you've seen any of my other videos, I don't really care for this design. Now I know these parts don't relate to the engine internally, but if I had to choose one to buy, it would be the Toro's only because of the build quality and the materials. However, I wish it didn't have the easy pull system because it could be a problem later on. Now, just out of curiosity, I did try to install the recoil assembly from the Ryobi onto the Toro, and it would have worked, but the front plastics didn't let it sit against the engine completely. I also tried to put the Toro recoil assembly on the Ryobi, and since it didn't have to make contact with the rest of the plastics, I was able to use it to turn the engine. If I wanted to use this part, I would just need to tap the other 4 holes, which wouldn't be that big of a deal. Now, if you compare the rear part of the engines, I think you'll find them to be almost identical except for the 2 ears on the lower part of the recoil mount on the Ryobi. In fact, that's the only difference between the two of them, which means they could have been made from the same molds, which might mean that the rest of the engine is also the same as well. In fact, if you take a step back and look at the entire back of the engine, you can see that it looks the same right down to the number of cooling fins on the cylinder and the 3 spots where they pour the molten metal into the molds for the cylinder. The same goes for the 4 spots on the back of the block. I have to say it's looking more like these are the same engines. Now there are a few other small differences like with the carb and how they mount to the cylinder, but I'd rather see what the engines look like once we get the front plastics off of them. I think that would give us a better idea as to how much alike these engines actually are. Now, I'm not saying just because they have different external components like different fuel tanks and recoils that they aren't the same, and I think it's because the manufacturer is trying to distinguish their two products. So why would they do that? The biggest reason is price. At the time of filming, the Ryobi could be bought for $150, while the Toro was a much more expensive $175. Now, that doesn't sound like much of a difference, but believe it or not, that's enough of a difference to keep someone from buying it. For that sort of difference, you want to make sure you're not buying the same product at a higher price. But what if they looked pretty much the same? Would you pay more for something that looks like a cheaper product? Of course not. I think that's what they're doing here. I'm also betting that the components you can't see are pretty much the same as well. So here are the two engines with their covers off, and I hate to say it, aside from their external components, they look very similar to each other. Now the ignition coils look almost identical as well, but one has a longer wire, so the part numbers don't match up. The same can't be said about the flywheels because if you look closely, it looks like they have the same part number cast into them. Now the clutches don't look to be the same, but more than likely they changed suppliers in the 4 years of manufacturing between them. So more than likely I should be able to swap the clutches between them and it should still work just fine. I also measured the distance between some of the mounting holes and they were very close to one another, which is absolutely fine because this is just a trimmer and not a part for an airplane. Now that I know they are basically the same engine with one being fractionally larger in displacement, I wonder if they both sound the same. To be honest, I absolutely admire the sound of the Toro, but every time I've started the Ryobi, I've never said to myself that it sounds anything familiar. Now you know what that means. We're going to start these two up and see if they sound anything alike. With it being very cool outside, I should have let the engine warm up more before taking out a full choke, but as you heard, it's a very mellow sound, especially when idling. The rattling noise wasn't the plastic, so more than likely it was the end of the drive shaft bouncing around from the vibration from the engine. Now it wasn't spinning because, as you saw earlier, this engine does have a clutch on it. I also realized that this rope is really short. I would like it about a foot longer. Now more than likely it was replaced after it had been reconditioned for resale because there's no way that this rope would look this nice after several years of use. If I find the time, I'll replace it, but for right now it's working just fine. Now it's time to start the Toro, and hopefully you agree that it doesn't sound the same. This thing hasn't been started in a long time, but I did run the fuel system dry before putting it away into storage. Now, it took quite a lot of pressing to get the bulb to partially fill with fuel, which is a good thing because it just cracked. Like I've said before, when they get to this color, they could break at any point. So as you've just heard, the sounds from the two of them are really close to one another, but the Toro sounds a lot nicer, and in my book, a lot cleaner, while the Ryobi has some other harmonics behind it. Although I didn't show it, but under the heat shields, the mufflers look identical to each other. They aren't the same part number, but I can't see why they would be any different inside. Now, even though there are a few loose pieces on this trimmer, I didn't hear anything rattling like I did on the other one, and the only thing I could think of is that this engine doesn't vibrate as much as the other one. I'll also have to fix this purge bulb now since it's broken. The reason I didn't fix it initially was that I didn't have any replacement parts available at the time. So my question is, do you think these are the same engines, just with different accessories like the recoils and fuel tanks? Or do you think there's enough of a difference between them to make one of them 15% more expensive than the other? Personally, I don't think it really matters, but if I had to buy one of these, if you hadn't guessed it, it would be the Toro. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.